This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word aptly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word. So welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer Courtney, Tim Knotts, and I discuss a book each week from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. It is Wednesday, August 30th, 2023. And today we're also joined by CCMM curriculum developer Stephanie Meter. Jennifer, tell us about this month's shows.
Right. Well, so we have been discussing classics of British literature. We have made our way through Beowulf, Pilgrim's Progress, Father Brown, and Pride and Prejudice. And today we're wrapping up that little mini series with Mere Christianity.
And thanks for that. So I just want folks to know you can access all our past episodes on my YouTube channel. It's at Leigh Bortons, or you can go to my website, leighbortons.com, and click on the archive buttons. Okay, Jennifer, let's get started.
Right. So I always ask you the same question to kick us off. Leigh, why is Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis in the Classical Conversations catalog?
So besides Mr. Lewis's influence on Christianity over the last 100 years and his connection with so many literary greats through his organization called the Inklings, his book, Mere Christianity, I find super helpful in a context like ours, where in classical conversations, our leaders are committed Christians who want to encourage people to know God and make him known, but we don't always know the background of the students who show up. And so we want them to be able to participate, in a place for them to talk about difficult things. And challenge 3 and 4 levels is to actually have them first read Mere Christianity and to really discuss the mereness of our faith. What does it take to be an Orthodox Christian with a little O? And so that's one reason. The other reason why is his books, of course, the Narnia series are super popular in our Challenge A and B seminars. And it's a way for the students as they get older to actually meet really well one of the authors of the books that they tend to love a whole lot and get to know him as a person of faith. So there's a lot of reasons that Lewis is loved, and I'm sure we'll talk about that over the next hour, so I don't want to spoil anything. But that's why he's this book in particular is in there, is the idea of mereness is really important.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I'm glad you mentioned Narnia, because you can actually see a lot of connections between the ideas that Lewis explored in a way that children can understand in the Narnia books, and here in Mere Christianity, you get to revisit some of those ideas in maybe a little bit more adult way. So that's a nice connection for our families who do stay with us all the way through. All right. So a couple of weeks ago, Stephanie, we talked about G.K. Chesterton being a really prolific author. And I think we would also say the same thing about C.S. Lewis. He didn't write just a few things. He wrote many, many things. So tell us a little bit about our author for today.
Yes. So he wrote some fiction books that we know of, like Leigh mentioned, the Chronicles of Narnia, and then also the Space Trilogy, which kicks off with Out of the Silent Planet. But he also wrote books that are more overtly theological. We can see a lot of those themes in his fiction, but then he wrote some books that are intentionally more philosophical. And he and J.R.R. Tolkien were good friends too. They were in a literary group together called the Inklings, and Tolkien actually sort of shepherded Lewis back into the faith a little bit. Lewis was born into a Christian household, but in his teens, he became an atheist. And then it wasn't until he kind of set out to prove why God doesn't exist that he started examining arguments and realized that maybe he does think God exists. And he describes himself as the most reluctant convert in England. But his conversations with Tolkien are one of the things that got him thinking and admitting to himself and others that maybe God is real after all.
Oh, yeah, that's great. I'm so glad you brought up the Inklings, and that really shows us the importance of having good Christian fellowship. And also, Lewis is not the only person who set out to disprove God and instead discovered him along the way. He's in good company with other Christian apologists who have had a similar experience. So we read this book, as we mentioned, in Challenge 4, and we use it for our theology. seminar in the Challenge 4 year. So Tim, we often talk about how theology is the queen of the sciences in a classical Christian education. What does this mean, and why would we put that book there?
How long do you have, Jennifer? So, yeah, I mean, we use the word science in a real particular way today, especially in American culture, the Western world, to mean the things that we do in a laboratory, studying using the scientific method, but going all the way back as far as St. Augustine of Hippo, the sciences were any field of knowledge having to do with the world around us. So that would include all kinds of philosophy and psychology, the natural sciences, or physics and chemistry. They were all part of what the medievals and ancients would call natural philosophy, and those were sciences. All the way up through the Middle Ages, that was still the case, and Thomas Aquinas considered theology a science, because through God's creation, the world around us, we can also come to know things about God, and then of course through his special revelation, his word. So it was called the Queen of Sciences in the medieval universities, because it was understood that all the other kinds of sciences were measured up against the ultimate thing, the ultimate science, which was theology, God's standards for truth. Was only in the late Enlightenment period. Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher, just at the very end of the 18th century, who redubbed philosophy the queen of sciences. And that was really the shift away from comparing things against God's standards, and instead comparing all things against man's standards of knowledge. I love the great lectures by John Henry Newman, where he talks about the purposes of a university, and in there he makes a really good argument that any education that excludes theology, that excludes the knowledge of God, is actually an incomplete education, because theology and the knowledge of God have been part of the defining nature of the understanding of man all the way since the beginning, and to ignore it today is to incompletely educate ourselves and our students.
Yeah, that's good. So if I can maybe sum up, and it'll be a broad brush, so you can correct me if I miss anything, but just that idea that sciences look at what the purpose of a creature is, and so theology gives us the final and best about the purposes of those creatures. And that's one reason we have it here in Challenge 4 as a capstone for our students, is pulling together all of that other knowledge that they've had and letting them think about it in light of scripture. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, that's a great way to capture theological and philosophical anthropology, as opposed to the modern materialist science of anthropology. Good job, Jennifer.
Okay, thanks. I've been thinking about it a lot lately. One of the things about this particular book is that it did not start off its life as a book. And this is actually common thing with some of Lewis's works. One way that he was so prolific is that some of his books started off as radio addresses and university talks. So we have books like Abolition of Man and The Weight of Glory that were all spoken addresses that were then recorded as talks. And so this is yet another one of those books that started off, I believe, as a radio. So tell us a little bit about that, Leigh, and why he started broadcasting these, and then how they came to be a book.
Yeah. So there was this book, a man named James Welch. He was the director of religious broadcasting for the BBC, and this was during the time of World War II, and Lewis had actually served in World War I. And there was a lot of questions that people had. And James Welch had just finished reading a book called The Problem of Pain, which related to Lewis's war experiences, as well as the death of friends and his wife and things like that. And so James Welch was really impressed. And so I'm going to read this quote. He sent this letter to Lewis saying, "I write to ask you whether you would be willing to help us in our work of religious broadcasting. The microphone is a limiting and rather irritating instrument but the quality of thinking and depth of conviction, which I find in your book, ought sure to be shared, I mean, with a great many people. So I thought that was interesting that, he thought the microphone wouldn't be as great as a book, which I think those of some book club would agree with, but here we are using a microphone, just like Lewis did, and trying to do our best with modern conveniences. So what happened is on Wednesdays from 7:45 p.m. to just 8 p.m., starting in August 1941, for 15 minutes, Lewis would give live talks entitled Right or Wrong, A Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. Well, he gave so many of them that they eventually became a series of books, but the first set of talks was put into Mere Christianity. Also during this time period, he was working on the screw tape letters, which was very popular. Some people, or not some people, Lewis has said it was popular because it was a skinny book and easy to read. But he had another series of talks at that time called What Christians Believe. And so the BBC, his books, his time as a professor, the popularity of the screw tape letters made it so this gentleman of kind of a humble background and a humble spirit became very, very famous. And something a lot of people don't know is his funeral would have been attended by thousands, except he happened to die on the same day JFK was assassinated. And so nobody paid attention to the passing of this wonderful man from our world to the real world.
I know, I had forgotten about that. So I think we could officially say, based on the background you just gave us, that C.S. Lewis would have enjoyed podcasting, or at least he would have done it. I don't know if he would have enjoyed it. I guess I can't speak to that.
Yeah, it's actually a great blessing that they recorded so many of his talks into books, because after the war, the BBC destroyed all of those recordings of his talks that he gave over the radio, and so they're lost for the most part, except for the ones that were thankfully transcribed for us.
Well, I have a treat for you. I actually found the only surviving audio left of him, and I found it today, and I've never heard his voice before, and made me want to cry. And so I thought, if I want to try playing it, I'm not sure if our technology will make it sound good or not, but do you mind me giving it a moment?
No, just go for it. I think that sounds great.
Well, let's see what happens.
We can't hear it, Leigh. Is it playing?
You can't hear it.
Mm-mm.
Bummer. Okay, well, maybe what we can do is link it to our recording once it's finally made. And if not, we'll figure out a different way, a different episode, because we're going to talk a lot about other C.S. Lewis books.
Yes, I would love to hear that.
Thanks.
Well, one of the ideas that that has lived on after Lewis, and by the way, I really love the way you said it, how he passed into the real world. He would have appreciated that description of his journey into heaven. Further up and further in, as he says in the Narnia books. So one of his ideas that has lived on from the talks that became Mere Christianity is this idea of the trilemma. And so normally when we talk about in logic, we have a dilemma, which has two possibilities for readers or listeners to choose between, but a trilemma offers up three options. So Lewis sets up this idea that we can never call Jesus simply a good teacher. And his trilemma is this: he's either a liar or a lunatic, or he's the Lord, but you can't escape through that trilemma by saying that he was a good teacher. So what do you guys think about this trilemma? Someone want to kick us off? Do you want to start, Steph?
Sure. I love that Lewis also put this idea into the Chronicles of Narnia a little bit, when the kids are debating if their little sister Lucy has really found a different world, or if she's lying, or who knows, and they take the problem to the professor, and the professor says, well, she's either lying, or she's crazy, or she's telling the truth, and you attest that she does not lie. She doesn't seem crazy, so we have to assume she's telling the truth. And so that little C.S. Lewis put that bit of theology into a kid's book. So I grew up with that a little bit. And I think he makes a strong argument that the things that Jesus was saying would either make him crazy, or he would have to be maliciously manipulating people into following him, or he is telling us the truth.
Yeah.
So,
Go ahead, Leigh.
okay, so he's got a lot of these trilemmas. Obviously the Trinity works really well to explain all kinds of philosophical ideas that encompass all the possible options. And he's got a number of them in this book. And one of my favorites is his talks about ships. And that if you're a ship who's not sound for whatever reason, you got a hole in the bottom or a broken mast, that's a problem. But you and another ship could both be sound ships, but run into each other because they're not steering well, or you hurt one another. But the thing is, what if you're a sound ship and you're a good captain, and your neighbor is a sound ship and a good captain, but the fleet is going in the wrong direction? It doesn't quite matter whether you think you're good at what you do or whether you have a healthy body or spirit if you can't see beyond what's right in front of you. And so you could just totally go in the wrong direction. And so I think that's where he got the idea, that Trinity, of how we're helping everyone we meet, either on the path to heaven or the path to hell, because where we're going mattered very much to him.
Yeah. Another book that's in our catalog is Born Again by Chuck Colson. And this is really the moment in Mere Christianity when he reads this that sticks him, right? It gets him to where he can't wriggle out from underneath this trilemma, and he wrestles with it for a while. But it's the thing that eventually convinces him that he has to give Jesus the opportunity to be true, right? To explore the possibility that what Jesus is saying is truth and not just myth or fable or someone's well-intentioned, misstatement of history. And I think that's really true for a lot of people. I think this is Lewis wrestled hard philosophically against Christianity, against theology for a long time. And so he's giving this not as a gotcha moment in his book, but as a real sort of lived experience for what he wrestled with. And I think it's very personal because of that.
Yeah, I think that's a good description of, so Lewis is a very logical thinker. And a lot of times when you're reading through Mere Christianity, you could formulate paragraphs into logical syllogisms. They very easily go into a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion so that you can constantly test his logic. But it's that merging of that with his lived experience that actually matters. So he's got the intellectual honesty and also, the ethos of who he is. And I love the way he elaborates on this. So he gives his illustration of the idea of Jesus being a lunatic, as he says, the things that he said, if he's not telling the truth, would put him on the level of a man who claims to be a poached egg. He's not a little crazy, he's a lot crazy. Or he would be a devil of hell, because he would be knowing that what he's saying is full of lies, and he would be willfully leading people astray. So therefore he can't be a good moral teacher on that end. So I like the way he fleshes out his trilemma. All right. Well, that was very interesting, Leigh. I think it's time to thank our sponsor.
Yeah, we want to thank classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books discussed can be purchased. We have the entire 2023 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leighbortons.com with links to the CC Books bookstore, so that you can go ahead and purchase any books that are upcoming that we'll be discussing. And we're going to put out next week. We're actually we're starting a new series on free market education, and we're reading an essay written by Edward Ellis about Davy Crockett called Not Yours to Give. And for those who want, it's actually a free PDF because it's so short and it's in the public domain, that you're welcome to go get that too for our next discussion. But it's one of my favorites.
Yeah, it'll be fun. We'll transition right from great classics of British literature into free market economics thinking. So I'm sure we'll see many connections along the way. We always do.
Yeah.
All right. So we've established some of the basic background that we need to tackle C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And so I always like, after we've done that, for us to read a few of the passages in the text and then respond to that. There's something that happens when we read things aloud. We hear it differently than when it was on the page, and also just honing in on a passage and really looking at the literal meanings of the words helps us to get into a text that might be difficult otherwise. So Stephanie, do you want to read our first passage for us?
Sure. This comes from page 28. First, as to putting the clock back. Would you think I was joking if I said that you can put a clock back, and that if the clock is wrong, it is often a very sensible thing to do? But I would rather get away from the whole idea of clocks. We all want progress, but progress means getting nearer to the place where you want to be. And if you've taken a wrong road, then to go forward does not get you any nearer. If you are on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. And in the case of the man who turns back, and in that case, the man who turns back is soonest the most progressive man.
Yeah, we don't associate progress with turning around backwards, but your example of the ship was a good one for this quote, Leigh. The ship's captain who is headed the wrong way will do better to turn around. So
I also think about Nicodemus and Jesus telling him you must be born again, and him thinking of it as a physical clock. You may have to go back and get my mother's womb somehow. And he's saying, no, you need to repent, which means to turn around.
mm-hmm.
And if you repent, you have the Holy Spirit and you're a new creature. And guess what? Time does get to start over again, because his mercies are new every morning to you at that point.
Yeah. How about you, Tim? Did you hear anything new listening to this one?
Yeah, progressive has a real strong meaning in today's culture, and it was a little different in Lewis's day, but not all that much different. That was still a political term in his day, as well as a philosophical one. And progressive comes from progress, right? It's moving forward towards something. And I think what that something is, what the goal is that you're moving toward, matters entirely. The modern materialist doesn't have a real defined goal. There's no set standard. To go back to what we were talking about earlier with theology being the queen of sciences, and Jennifer, your point about that man has a purpose, right? Mankind is made for something. Progress for the believer is toward Christ-likeness. Progress in the world is some ambiguous thing that means whatever it means in the moment that it's said by whoever is saying it. And so I think this is lovely, because here Lewis is talking about the fact that it's right. Progress means getting nearer to the place you want to be. And we have something to progress toward, and we can rejoice in that, and know, hopefully then know when we've taken that wrong turn. And to go back to what we talked about with Pilgrim's Progress, right? That we need to be on the road to the celestial city.
Yeah.
Could you tell us more about, like Lewis wrote, and you mentioned it a week or two ago, Pilgrim's Regress? Is that what it was called? Do you know what was it? I have not read this story in a really long time.
Yeah, Pilgrim's Regress is a tough read. You'll definitely want some help and maybe a commentary on it to dig into it, unless you're very, very familiar with a lot of modern philosophy, because it's an allegory like Pilgrim's Progress, but it's capturing Lewis's philosophical and theological journey from his place of atheism to Christianity. And he does, in that book, travel a long way towards something and find out in the end that he has to turn around and go back. And that's where the actual destination is. And thus Pilgrim's Regress is he's retracing his steps back to the place that he had left, not moving forward toward the place originally he thought he was going.
So it ties into this paragraph. It makes me think of last week, as we want to integrate things. So last week we talked about Chesterton, and Chesterton said that a progressive was somebody who worked really hard to promote new bad ideas, and a conservative is someone that works really hard to keep the bad ideas. And so you tie that forward to Ellis that we're reading next week, and how Davy Crockett discovered that about himself. And so these three totally different authors all come to the same point about going backwards is going forward.
Yeah. So I have two thoughts going on right now. One of them is from Alice in Wonderland, where she comes to the fork in the road and is asking for directions and is asked, well, where do you want to go? And she doesn't know. And so therefore she is counseled that it doesn't much matter which fork in the road she takes. And so sometimes we're talking to folks, particularly if we're talking about classical Christian education, we're talking to people who are curious about what does progress in education mean, that don't know what they mean by that. And so they're not quite at the point where an about face would even matter, because they're not quite sure what they mean by where they're going. So that's one level of thing, is not actually knowing where you mean to go, which happens to us all the time. And then the other thing is, I look at this quote, and I've often used it when I'm talking to audiences about turning around back toward the motto of classical Christian education. So what do you guys think? Is this a fair use of this quotation?
Let Stephanie answer.
I mean, I think yes. I think the concept can be both encouraging and kind of a gut check. Because on the one hand, I'm the type of person who thinks if I just do it harder, then I can make progress. And this is a reminder that sometimes that's not the answer. You can't keep doing the wrong thing harder and expect to get the right thing. So that can be kind of a gut check, but then also a relief and a reminder that turning around and doing something different may feel like regression. And in a way it is, but it's still towards the goal that you actually want to reach. So I think with education, it can be helpful to remind people that yes, you might not be making forward progress for a little while, but that's okay. And that's really what you want. You have to get back to the path that you actually want to be walking down. So I would hope that that would be an encouragement, and sort of an encouragement that it's not like doing the thing harder is not always the answer. Sometimes you need to do something different, and it's not just a matter of you're not putting in the effort. That's very often not what's wrong.
You know, it's funny to me how in athletics, this is done day in, day out, and everyone understands it. But when it comes to mental activities, everyone forgets. So for example, if your golf swing is just out of whack, you don't keep working on that swing. You back up and figure out this fundamentals. How am I holding the thing? Am I using the right club? You know, how are my hips? Those things. Same with like if you have a physical injury or some sort of damage and you have to walk, you don't just get up and walk and run. You have to re-engage all those muscles you engaged as a toddler. And we know that this is true, but when it comes to wanting to be better at math or better at Latin, heaven forbid we go back to a kindergarten level book.
Yeah. And so often what we do, one of the fallacies I see in education all the time is, if let's just take math, since you brought that up as an example. Okay, if test scores, for whatever they're worth, are showing that students are not comprehending math, then so often our systems say, well, let's just start teaching it younger, which isn't necessarily the answer to that problem. It's maybe the way we're teaching it, just as you described. We might need to back up, not in the sense of backing up and teaching it earlier and earlier, but in the sense of backing up to the fundamental concepts and teaching them better and better and practicing them more and more.
Yeah, we have a problem in our modern world of being all about whatever's the newest thing. The newest thing is the best thing, right? So the newest model for teaching something is the best model for teaching something, except for often that's not actually true. Or the newest Bible study on whatever book of the Bible is the best Bible study for whatever, and that's often not true either. So being freed from the tyranny of the now and going back to find the gold, the true foundation, the good thing that was there before is sometimes the best way. And my mom was a crocheter, and she would crochet, and if she found that there was an error where she dropped a stitch down some rows ago, the best thing to do was to tear out rows and rows of crocheting to get back to that error, to reset that row and move forward. Because if you didn't, everything from there on would be skewed. It would be all be off. And I think that's the way that we've ended up in education today, right? Is we keep trying to build on the bad model, and just building on the bad model doesn't make it any better.
And we've got all kinds of buttresses shoring it up when really we just needed a straighter foundation.
Yeah, exactly. Well, good. Well, hopefully our listeners will be thinking about places to turn around this week. I know this quotation, and I've read it many, many times. It always convicts me. So Lewis has a way of convicting me at one moment and then causing me to cry out for joy the next and burst into tears. So anyway, I have very emotional responses. And our next quote, Lewis is in Mere Christianity talking about why free will is so important. But along the way, I think he manages to tell us something really amazing about love. So Tim, do you want to read that one for us?
Sure. This is from about 20 pages later than the one that Stephanie just read for us. The happiness which God designs for his higher creatures is the happiness of being freely, voluntarily united to him and to each other in an ecstasy of love and delight, compared with which the most rapturous love between a man and a woman on this earth is mere milk and water, and for that they must be free.
I love that phrase, an ecstasy of love and delight. What do you guys think about this one?
I think maybe it's one of the reasons we're confused right now about what the love between a man and a woman is. And I don't just mean the latest trends. I mean, the divorce rate and just all kinds of things have been, fornication, been yucky for, 100 years now. And during that same time is when we've been losing this ecstasy of love and delight in our Lord. And so it's translating into the inability to even love and delight in what's in front of us. And, love and delight is not momentary. It's through suffering and after a really long time. And so milk is sustaining and water is a good thing. You could go on and say maybe that was a bad comparison because I'm quite happy that we have a lot of water, but what he's trying to say is there's substance to the one and the other one is just more vacuous. So.
Earlier you mentioned the weight of glory, that series of talks that are collected for us too. Lewis talks in there about the fact that God made us lovers of beauty, right? That we're innately lovers of the beautiful and that our souls are attracted to it because ultimately it's God who is beauty. God is ultimately beautiful. And so we don't just want to be observers of beauty. We want to be participants in beauty because our souls long to participate in God, right? We love the idea of being united with him. And that delight, right? That delight is part of what draws us in this life toward sanctification and toward participation in the church, right? Because he talks about that here of being not just united with God, but with each other in our love for God and loving other believers because of their love for God and because of his image being grown in them because of their sanctification. That's the closest we get to heaven in this life.
Yeah, that's gorgeous. I sometimes like to compare, it's just like you did with Weight of Glory, Lewis to Lewis, commenting on Lewis. And I just happened to be reading Screwtape Letters a couple of weeks ago. And in one of the letters, Wormwood says that the enemy, meaning God, takes the risk of free will because he has a curious fantasy of making all these disgusting little human vermin into what he calls his free lovers and servants. Sons is the word he uses with his inveterate love of degrading the whole spiritual world by unnatural liaisons with the two-legged animals, which is just a great, disgusting little vermin that are humans. But I love that, he clearly understands, this fictional demon understands that God desires those liaisons with us, and that the only way to do that and to have that true unity is through letting us be free to love him. So that sort of negative version of this quote helps me to see really what's going on and to just celebrate that relationship, because I'm reading Theology with my students and also Genesis in Challenge 4 and looking at how very different the relationship from the very first word is between God and his creation versus the Greek gods and the chaos of their creation. And so I've just been reveling for the past few weeks in that liaison, the unnatural liaison with us two-legged animals that leads to such ecstasy of love and delight.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and the way that he puts it from Screwtape's side, that he actually, it makes me feel more loved when he says he actually loves the little vermin.
I know.
Right?
Right, and here that we're called his higher creatures, right? That we are his creation, but that we're special. We're set apart by God for something more than the rest of creation. And also, this is such an attack on that dualist thing that was going on, right? I mean, Lewis was well versed in philosophy, and he had no trouble with bridging the gap between matter and spirit, the way that some people have trouble. That God, though he's perfect in spirit, can love and be united in some way with us, even though we're created material beings.
Yeah. And that's a beautiful mystery. So we're getting close to the end of our conversation today. So we'll see if we may just have to read this last one as an exhortation.
Okay, I can do that.
This,
you want me to?
This is a thing I do with my students. I was just going to say, I often do this with my students where I'll read them the opening of Paul's letters at the beginning of the day and the closings at the end as a way to send them out. And this felt the same to me when I pulled Lewis's last words in Mere Christianity. So Leigh, do you want to read it for us and send us off?
The principle runs through all life from top to bottom. Give up yourself and you will find your real self. Lose your life and you will save it. Submit to death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being and you will find eternal life. Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will be really yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him, and with him, everything else thrown in. Thank you once again, Jennifer. It was good talking to you guys.
Yeah, thanks.
See you next week.
Bye.